Okay, baby, I just learned something which I find really fascinating, and I feel like I just have to share it with you because, like, no matter what I learn or no matter what I do, no matter what it is that excites me or whatever happens, I feel like I need to tell you first. I hope you don't mind. So, I just need to tell you. So, basically, I was listening to this podcast about the brain, about psychology, about neuroscience, and I learned like three really interesting things. So these were all principles to do with like the brain and how the brain works. So I'll keep it like as simple as possible, like really simple. So in the brain, there's something called the prefrontal cortex. And basically it's the part of the brain which is one of the newest, like the newer parts based on evolution. And science thinks it's where like a lot of consciousness lies. The prefrontal cortex actually has like a lot of different functions. But one of those functions is rule sets. So it defines rule sets. So, for example, different scenarios have different rule sets, like social scenarios, right? So, when you're in a social setting, you're with friends or you're at work or whatever, there are certain rules you need to follow. So, certain social rules, things you can say, things you can't say, things you can do, things you can't do. So, all those rules, that rule set is held in your prefrontal cortex. And so the way the brain gets information is through the senses, and then the senses send it to this other part of the brain called the insula. And there's another part called the ACC. Don't worry, you don't have to remember this, but basically, like the stimulus from outside comes in through your senses, through your sight, sound, etc., goes through your insula and your ACC, which are more primitive parts of the brain where like baser responses lie. So the information comes in through your senses, goes through the insula and the ACC, which are more primitive, and then goes up into the prefrontal cortex, where you can do your rational thinking from. So basically, when you switch rule sets, so you must have seen that experiment where you're shown words, which are colors. So you might be shown the words blue, red, yellow, etc. And then you just have to read the words. But then they'll present the test to you again, but now the words are in different colors. So you might get the word blue, but the color of the word is red. Or like, the word yellow, but the color of the word is purple. So they'll ask you first to read the word. So, it'll be the word blue in a red color, and then you have to read blue. And then they'll say to you, what color is it? And like the word might say yellow, but the color is purple. So then you read yellow, but you have to say purple. So that's called a Stroop test. And when you switch from saying the word to saying the color, it takes you a second. So that's actually your prefrontal cortex switching rule sets. So that was quite interesting. But the thing which fascinated me the most, right, is that when your PFC switches rule sets, it sends a parallel signal to your heart and your lungs to slow down. So when your prefrontal cortex switches rule sets, a parallel signal is sent which slows down your heart rate, slows down your breathing. So it literally calms you down. So when you look at something from a different perspective, you feel calmer. That's why. It's because your cortex is switching rule sets and then your body is getting a calming signal sent to it in parallel. And so this is amazing because there's a theory that people who are anxious, who suffer from anxiety, right, that they don't do enough different stuff. They don't switch rule sets often enough, so their bodies don't get those kind of like calming signals that they need. And then basically, the more primitive parts of the brain that I mentioned earlier, the insula and the ACC, they start leading the decisions of the prefrontal cortex instead of the prefrontal cortex leading their decisions. So then those more primitive parts of the brain start leading decisions in people who have anxiety. And they lead them basically from like more basic responses, like fight or flight responses, like basically like, fight or flee type of responses. And so I just found that really interesting. So whenever you switch rule sets, whenever you change your perspective, or whenever you do something new, which either switches your rule sets in your prefrontal cortex or which forces your cortex to like make up new rule sets, then your body is sent a calming signal in parallel. So basically, to stay calm, to stay balanced, you've got to keep doing new things. Isn't that incredible? Like, isn't that really like, I just find it so interesting. Okay, so that's the first thing. I'll be quick, I promise. I'll be quick because I know I'm talking a lot. Okay, so the second thing is you've heard of dopamine, right? Obviously. So everyone's heard of dopamine, but I don't know if everyone knows what dopamine actually is or what it does. So dopamine does a few things. So dopamine is involved in your reward system, but basically it serves as like the motivation for like everything. So to motivate us to eat, to have sex, it's literally a motivator to do anything. So we have like a base level of dopamine all the time. So that's like a base level of activation. So there's like a certain level of dopamine which exists in the brain. I won't go into how it works in the brain because then we'll be here all day. But yeah, there's like a base level. And then when you have an expectation, when you build an expectation, when the expectation is positive, your dopamine rises in response to that expectation. So say for argument's sake, you have a kid or like a nephew or whatever, and you say to them, okay, today we're going to go for ice cream. So their dopamine will rise in response to you saying, we're going to go for ice cream. So then when you go for ice cream, their dopamine is high, they're excited, they're expecting the reward. When you get there, the ice cream shop's closed. So what happens is that they had an expectation, dopamine rose because of their expectation, and when the expectation wasn't met, their dopamine level fell below baseline. So it falls actually lower than it was before, and that is what disappointment is. So that's where you feel the disappointment. I find that fascinating because it just shows that expectations are the root of all disappointment. You know what I mean? Like, it's really interesting. So, I mean, I know it's difficult not to have expectations because they're part of how we are as humans. But I think it's just really important to be aware of that fact. You know, when you have an expectation for something positive, if it doesn't happen, your dopamine will drop below baseline and then you'll feel that disappointment. But that's the physical reason why that happens, which again, yeah, I thought was so interesting. And the third thing is again to do with dopamine. So as I mentioned, dopamine provides the motivation for us to do pretty much anything. And so dopamine has loops. This sounds a bit weird, but let me explain. So basically, when you're going to do a task, your dopamine is involved, your dopamine levels are involved in you doing that task. So just a simple task like making your bed. So you get up, you have the idea, okay, I'm going to do this. And your dopamine will be a certain level based on that task you're going to do. Then once you complete the task, that dopamine loop closes, and then you have a little bit more dopamine because you've completed it. And so this happens with all and any tasks. So when you complete a task, the dopamine loop completes and the loop closes, and then you have a little bit more dopamine than you had before. Okay? So there's another hormone which you would have heard of called adrenaline. And adrenaline forms the basis for all neural energy. So all energy in the brain comes from adrenaline. And there's a part of the brain, I forget the name now, which just sprinkles adrenaline over the brain, like over all of it pretty much. And that is the energy provider. So adrenaline is manufactured from dopamine. So the more dopamine you have in your brain, the more adrenaline you'll have because adrenaline is manufactured directly from dopamine. So basically, the more tasks you complete, the more dopamine you'll have, and then the more adrenaline can be manufactured from that dopamine, and then the more energy your brain will have. So what this means practically, you must have had that kind of like feeling when you complete a task and then you feel good, and then you can complete another one. You go like, okay, cool, that's that done. Let's do the next thing. So what that is that's that dopamine loop closing. You getting a little bit more dopamine, which makes you feel better. Then that dopamine gets converted to adrenaline, which in turn provides your brain energy. So it's incredible, right? So yeah, this is the third thing. I just find it so interesting. So when you complete tasks, it gives you more energy, like more mental energy. Then you must have also experienced the opposite, because I know I have. Like when there's a task lingering and you haven't done it, either because you're procrastinating or because you did something else instead, which you shouldn't have done. Maybe you had to like finish an assignment and instead you did something else, like you played video games or you went out with friends or you did something you knew you shouldn't have done instead of doing what you actually had to do. And then you just feel a bit shit for it. And you feel like you don't have a lot of energy, like you feel like your mental energy is low. And that's because your dopamine is low. And that's because you didn't have enough dopamine to create enough adrenaline to give yourself that mental energy. So then the way to get past that is to then complete another task. So then you can complete something else, like a smaller task. Then you'll have more dopamine, which will create more adrenaline, which will give you more energy. So basically, this is why people say like completing small tasks leads to big wins, because it gives you more like mental energy. So if you have like a big task to do and it's really difficult, either do a small task and then kind of pep yourself up a bit, or you can break your bigger task down into smaller tasks then those smaller tasks, once they're completed, they give you that dopamine, which then gives you that energy. Yeah, so those are those three things. And yeah, I know it took me a while to explain them, but yeah, I just find them so interesting. So yeah, the first one was about how like changing your rule sets and providing yourself with variety sends calming signals to your body. The second one was that dopamine goes up in response to expectation, and if the expectations aren't met, then it falls below baseline, which causes disappointment. And the third one, the one I just mentioned, is that completing tasks leads to mental energy because of dopamine and adrenaline manufacture. Baby, thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry, I just had to tell you. Like, I just found it so fascinating, like so interesting, so interesting. Okay, I promise. I'll stop talking now. I'll stop talking. So tell me. I missed you today. How was your day? Tell me everything. Mwah. Thank you so much for listening. If you're a regular listener, you will know that this is not my usual type of audio, and this is not what I usually make. And the reason for me making this is because I've genuinely just found out these things, and I'm genuinely really, really fascinated by them. So if you have listened all the way to the end, I really, really appreciate you. Honestly, thank you so much for listening. And everything I've said now is absolutely true. You can go look them up if you want. I mean, and if you do, then I'll be very surprised. And if you do, then put it in the comments, because I'd love to have a discussion, because I love this kind of thing. Anyway, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. And I shall see you on the next audio, which I think will probably be more of my usual flavor. But if you have anything you'd like me to say, then let me know. Because as you just heard, I'm open to suggestions and trying new things. All right, love. See you on the next one. Mwah.